I'm Alex Haugland.
And I'm Amy Haugland.
And this is our 1967 Sunbeam Tiger Mk2. Welcome to Everyday to Exotic.
There's over 200 cars in the Haugland Collection.
And it just keeps growing.
Our goal is to try and drive them all.
Each episode, we'll talk about the car's history, showcase its design and features, and dive into its mechanicals.
Then we'll take it out on a drive through the beautiful roads of Oregon.
Finally, we'll rate our car to see where it stands in the Haugland rank. In this episode, we'll explore the only Chrysler product to come with a Ford V8.
Amy discovers yet another thing that Carroll Shelby signed.
Apparently he signed everything. And Alex makes a little British car go vroom.
For roads like this, it's absolutely fantastic.
All this and more in today's episode of Everyday to Exotic.
But first, let's take a look into the car's history. Sunbeam was founded in the United Kingdom in 1905, building cars with an emphasis on high-performance luxury automobiles. Along with building cars for sale, they actively participated in Grand Prix racing, competing with the likes of Bentley. They also were chasing land speed records, claiming the records repeatedly with a purpose-built car driven by the likes of Malcolm Campbell. By 1934, however, Sunbeam was suffering financially due to the collapse of the stock market and debts incurred to fund Grand Prix racing coming due, forcing the company to sell.
Sunbeam ended up being purchased by the Roots brothers and founders of the Roots Group. The Roots brothers' involvement in the car industry began with an extensive car dealership and service network. Using funding and financial support, the Roots Group acquired a number of well-established automobile manufacturers such as Hillman, Talbot, Singer, Humber, Commer, and Carrier, along with Sunbeam. Many of their brands sold badge-engineered variants of the same design aimed at different segments of the market. For them, Sunbeam was solidly aimed at the higher performance, more sports car-oriented market to compete with the likes of MG and Triumph.
In 1959, Sunbeam introduced a new open two-seat roadster called the Sunbeam Alpine, aimed squarely at the American market. These were well-built, solid cars with a body design influenced heavily by American automobiles. The primary designer, Kenneth Howes, had worked previously with Raymond Loewy on Studebaker designs, and then Ford in Detroit before working for the Roots Group.
The floor pan of the car was borrowed from the Hillman Husky, while the drivetrain and suspension came mostly from the Sunbeam Rapier. The Alpine sold reasonably well and evolved over 5 series with suspension and body changes, as well as larger displacement variants of the same engine. The weakness of the Alpine, however, was the lack of power from the engine. In looking for a solution that wouldn't involve the high expense of designing a new engine, they first approached Ferrari to redesign their 4-cylinder engine, but negotiations fell apart. After which the idea came to fit a 260 cubic inch Ford V8 engine, as Carroll Shelby had done with the AC Cobra.
Sunbeam commissioned 2 prototypes to be built, one by Carroll Shelby and second one by Ken Miles. Ken Miles managed to build a running converted car within a week, proving the concept was feasible, while the Shelby prototype was more refined and proved to be a car with significantly improved performance to the Alpine.
After Lord Roots found out that the Tiger project was happening without his knowledge, he begrudgingly agreed to let the prototype car be shipped to the UK, where he insisted he personally drove the car before he would approve pursuing production. After the drive, he was quite impressed and personally contacted Henry Ford II to negotiate the purchase of the engines and gearboxes.
The Tiger finally premiered to the public in 1964 at the New York Motor Show. The body was largely based on the Alpine Series 4, with very few cosmetic changes, but extensive modifications to fit the much larger V8 engine. This was carried out under contract by the Jensen Motor Company. The Tiger was not a massive success, despite being a much better performing car than the Alpine in many ways, partly due to its higher expense and potentially due to it not appearing much different from the cheaper Alpine.
By this point, the Roots Group was having deeper financial difficulties and were exploring merging with another company to help stabilize operations. Chrysler bought a significant interest in the company in 1964, and in 1967, they bought a controlling interest in the company with the goal of establishing a presence in Europe. Around the same point, Ford stopped manufacturing the 260 cubic inch V8, and as a result, the car switched to the 289 cubic inch engine. With the change of the engine, Sunbeam did a facelift on the styling of the car and called the car the Tiger II. The production was short-lived, however, as Chrysler was not interested in continuing to sell cars under their ownership that were powered by a competitor's engine, and no Chrysler V8 engine would fit into the car, so production ended in 1967.
In all, there were 6,450 Mark I Tigers and 633 Mark II Tigers built, almost all of which were sold to the United States.
So the body of the Sunbeam Tiger is almost exactly identical to the Alpine it was based on. All of the external sheet metal and everything is pretty much the same. The main difference was just little trim accessories that they put on them. Definitely an American-influenced car design, and considering the designers working for Ford in the past, that's not overly surprising. It also meant that it was a good car to try and sell to the American market. The styling really looks a lot like, say, a 1955 Ford Thunderbird. You've got kind of the same general shape. On the Mark IIs, you even have this egg crate grille that really fits that same image.
So one of the things that I love about the Tiger Mark II, and that sets it apart from both the Alpine and the Tiger Mark I, is it has a lot more shiny bits. So neither the Alpine nor the Tiger Mark I had the chrome on the wheel arches, or the chrome that comes down the side here. The Tiger Mark I did have a tiny little chrome strip that lined up with the Tiger badge on the side that went all the way down the length of the car. This doesn't have that, this has the cool stripes instead. Obviously it's a Tiger badge instead of an Alpine badge, and they want to be really sure that even when you're driving down the road, you know that's a V8 in there. So another important badge on this side of the car is this one. This is called a Pentastar. That's the Chrysler emblem. Chrysler invested heavily in Sunbeam toward the end of the Tiger's production, and they wanted to make sure that their symbol was on there too. Their influence also led to the text right here changing. On the original Tiger, this didn't say Sunbeam. It said powered by Ford. And Chrysler was like, no, we're not going to have Ford's name on our car. Thank you ever so much. In the wonderful world of television, there was a show called Get Smart, and Agent Smart drove a Tiger. However, for a lot of the outside shots, a lot of the stunt shots, and a lot of the shots where things like the license plate flipping and all those things, that was an Alpine.
With Tiger badges.
With Tiger badges. Because with that big V8 in there, they couldn't fit the mechanics to flip the license plate or do any of those things. So they had to use an Alpine.
Because they're using an Alpine instead of a Tiger, they ended up dubbing V8 engine noises over the shots that they're using the Alpine to make it at least sound like the Tiger. And you can usually tell which shots are which because one has a single tailpipe, the other one has two. So there were a number of accessories available for both the Tiger and the Alpine, but especially for the Tiger. One that was shared between them is the optional steel removable hardtop. This is actually a pretty well-made top. It does a good job of sealing up the car. It makes it actually really usable and kind of all-weather. And I'm glad we have it for this car. Underneath, there is actually a really good soft top that tucks away in its own compartment, and it allows you to basically close this up and turn it into a standard convertible as well. And the nice thing on this car is you can have both the soft top and the hard top fitted to the car at the same time. Okay, here at the front of the car, we can see some of the other changes for the Mark II versus the Mark I Tiger and the Alpines. One is the egg crate style grille. That came in with the Mark II. The Sunbeam badge changed into this badge here on the hood. Originally, there were little letters Sunbeam, individual letters along the front here, spelling out Sunbeam. And then on the grille, there was a little Roots Group Sunbeam emblem on the grille itself. That logo, by this point in time, completely absent from the car.
I really like the front of this car. I like that the bumpers are still chrome. You have the little overriders with a little bit of padding, but this isn't the era where we start to go crazy with health and safety.
An interesting thing on this car compared to most other British cars, the headlight rings are painted. And that was originally the case on all of the Sunbeam Tigers. So the wheels on this car are pretty much the original configuration. These cars came with 13-inch wheels. It makes it kind of a pain to find a really good tire for them. It is a steel wheel with a chrome hubcap and a nice aluminum trim ring, essentially, that goes around it. That's something else that changed between the Mark I and the Mark II Tigers. This is sort of the straight line pattern. The Mark I had a crisscross pattern instead.
And while we're back here, we have the gas cap, It's fairly flush to the car, doesn't offer a lot of wind resistance, and I love that it's contrasting chrome.
And it operates with a nice little push button release, which makes it pretty easy to... Do you want to...
Shiny.
You can tell who actually puts gas in this car.
Yeah, I don't. So by 1967, when this came out, this design was a little bit dated. This is late 50s design. You have the really cool fins. I think they're really cool. You have these neat, oval combined tail lights, turn signals, and reflectors that fit beautifully into that fin. Also back here, we have the fabulous chrome bumpers. We've got the little overriders again. And because this is a Tiger, dual exhaust.
The trunk itself is actually a pretty nice setup for the most part. It has a couple weirdnesses. There's a push button down here that releases it, and a little handle to raise it up. It holds itself up beautifully, just using these built-in stays. Pretty much nothing to worry about there. So you'll also notice this odd bump out here. That is in order to basically cover up the battery, which instead of being up front or underneath the car or anything, got moved to the trunk because of limits of space. We can lift up this and you will see our spare tire here, our tools and everything to change the spare tire here, battery. All of this is pretty much straightforward. And one thing also sort of unique to the Tiger Mk2 is where they put the fuel pump, which moved instead of being in a little cubby behind the seats, is now down here in the spare wheel well for the Alpine wheel, which doesn't work for fitting the wheel for the Tiger.
They did a lot of move around and make do when converting from the Alpine to the Tiger.
The height of the spare tire and everything eats up a lot of your trunk space. This eats up a fair amount more, so it limits wine capacity by a fair amount. I mean, we could potentially put maybe 2, maybe 3 boxes of wine here before we start running out of height. But otherwise, that's probably about it. I'd say 2 boxes of wine.
But you could put a nice little flat rollerboard suitcase back there and go weekending.
Absolutely. You'll also see there are little cutouts on the sides here. And these cutouts allow you to get in to access the back of the lights so that you can actually change out the bulbs without having to take the entire taillight apart. To close this, you just basically push down. It releases itself. And that's it.
Good solid thunk.
These really are well-built cars. They're very, very solid construction. Sort of a detriment when you have an underpowered engine, but not a problem at all with that V8. Okay, while Amy's knitting in the car, on to the mechanicals. So, the engine of this, again, is a Ford small block 289 cubic inch V8. And if Amy would do the honors of pulling the lever inside, marked bonnet because it's a British car, it releases the hood, which opens forward. And there's a nice little prop here to keep it in place. The general body of these cars were really well made, but they're Alpines when they went to Jensen. And then Jensen did kind of a really crappy job of converting them into Tigers. There were a lot of compromises that Jensen made in order to basically fit this engine and drivetrain into this car. One of them is the transmission tunnel. The transmission tunnel is much bigger than the original one. They just came in with a torch, cut it out, and then welded in over the top of it. They did a really lousy job of sealing all the seams and trying to get everything kind of cleaned up. It still is a messy torch cut edge that they left before they welded in the new transmission cover. That's an area that they tended to rust. Another thing that they did is the exhaust on this, they didn't want to pass it underneath the frame of the original Alpine. And the frame on this car is an X frame, so it has to pass, basically for straight exhaust, it has to pass through the first set of frame rails and then under the second in order to basically get to the back. Jensen did this by cutting out sections of the frame and welding in covers. But again, they didn't clean things up very well. And now you've got holes into the frame of the car. So one of the common problems with these is rust in those areas. You have to take into account these cars were not intended to be still on the road. They were being built with the idea that you would own it, you would drive it, 5 years later you would sell it, it would eventually go to a junkyard, be gone. They weren't expecting this car to still be on the road 50 years later. So you have to kind of give some credit that a lot of them are still around, but a lot of them tended to develop rust problems, especially in these areas. The engine really fills this compartment. It's a pretty good sized engine in the space. It just barely fits between the frame rails. Nothing overly special about this engine in many ways. It's a 2-barrel Autolite carburetor that's originally fitted to these. All of these cars came with a 2-barrel carburetor. You could optionally put on a higher performance manifold. You could do all of the typical modifications you'd do to make your V8 faster, stronger, more powerful, whatever, and it'll theoretically work in the Tiger. So these could actually be built up quite a bit. The problem is it's a very compromised engine as far as cooling is concerned. So the more power you put into it, the more heat it's going to generate, the more likely you're going to overheat. So be a little bit cautious about Sunbeam Tigers that have been modified significantly to create more power. It can be done effectively, but it can also just lead to a ton of problems. In order to help with cooling, there is a radiator overflow tank mounted to the side. And then you'll also notice this odd little thing here mounted to the support is actually the heater control valve, controlling hot water going into the heater core inside the car to warm it up, make it more comfortable. This AC air filter is 100% correct for these cars. They all came with basically the same one. Some of them I think are more of a hammerite paint finish. This may not technically be correct for this car, but it is the correct filter otherwise. One other interesting thing that you'll see is this, which is a remote oil filter assembly. And a lot of that was because there really wasn't much room where the original oil filter screwed in to be able to get a good sized filter. I've seen cars, Tigers, done with this very small, very short, squat oil filter that doesn't necessarily have a lot of filter material that will fit in that very, very tight space on the original mount on the block. But the factory solution was to relocate the filter to a more accessible position here. But it also makes it very easy to spill oil all over your engine bay when you're changing the oil. It's very hard to get to the spark plugs on this engine, especially the one on the driver's side in the very back. When Ford designed the engine, they angled the spark plugs to basically make it easier to clear the exhaust and everything. With them being angled towards the back of the car, in order to get that rearmost spark plug, there's actually a little grommet you can pull out in the driver's side footwell to put a wrench through in order to unscrew the spark plug. It makes this kind of a pain to change the plugs on. I've done it. It's not terrible, but it's not a lot of fun either. Original Tigers, the Mark I's, came with a generator. This was all Ford componentry. So it was a Ford generator, it's a Ford coil, Ford ballast resistor, Ford distributor, Ford everything, pretty much. Originally, these cars had a generator instead of an alternator. This being a Mark II, we're actually finally updated to an alternator. So definitely an improvement on this car. Although all of the engine electronic bits are Ford, like the ballast resistor, the coil, and that type of thing, most of the rest of the electronics in this car are Lucas. Typical British stuff. 2 fuses for the entire car, because Lucas likes setting your cars on fire. It's not necessarily that bad. Once everything's pretty clean and working properly, it's not a major problem. But with 2 circuits, if anything goes wrong, it has a tendency to be a bit more disastrous than it is on most modern cars. It's why modern cars have lots of fuses and lots of circuits. This is our brake booster. So it's a remote brake booster, single circuit. The brake pedal basically operates the master cylinder, comes in here. This will take some engine vacuum and give it some assistance in order to get you better brakes. And from here, it goes to the front and the rear of the car. The transmission on all these cars when they were new was a Ford 4-speed top-loader gearbox. It's actually a really nice gearbox to drive. It's fairly precise going in and out. It's got a reverse lockout built into it. It's a really good fit for these cars. It then goes to the rear end, which is essentially a British version of a Dana 44. So a pretty good, strong differential, kind of rated for these kinds of engines. One of the downsides is, in order to fit this engine, they had to compromise the location of the steering rack, which leads to some really strange steering geometry. It actually has a steering rack as opposed to a steering box. You can't really see it because it's buried under the engine, but because of the compromised geometry, it has a tendency to have a little bit of bump steer and things, especially under load. It makes it a better touring car than a race car. Some of that can be fixed and worked out of it, but it is a little bit tricky to make that happen. Front suspension on these cars is a double wishbone setup with a tubular shock absorber, basically on either side, running in the middle of the spring. It is part of a subframe assembly itself that bolts in underneath the car. And that subframe assembly itself is pretty unique to the Tiger with the way it's put together. It also carries the steering rack that actually handles the steering on the car. The rear is all leaf sprung. That was a little bit of a compromise. The original of the Alpine also had a leaf sprung rear axle. And in order to basically make it work, they ended up putting a heavier axle in, changed the leaves a little bit stronger, but these have a tendency to have a little bit of axle wrap because of the amount of torque on the engine, especially with how light the car is. And so what ends up happening is that you can load up the spring and get sort of a little bit of a wheel hop from the axle wrap. And so one of the common accessories at this point was to fit traction bars, basically that would mount to the spring and then frequently be welded to the body of the car. This car has traction bars. They were fitted quite a while ago. There were a couple variants that they did. The ones that are on here are the ones that are welded to the body to help prevent that axle wrap from basically causing problems driving it. One of the downsides is, quite frequently, where they're welded to on the body really isn't strong enough to handle the force themselves. So they have a tendency to tear at the welds and kind of crack up the body itself. But really, it's a robust drivetrain in these cars. Not much you can do that would damage that.
So before we talk about the interior, we're going to take off the hardtop so that you can see in here. But before we do that, check this out. Hardtop itself has these little ventilation windows in the back. I just think that's kind of cool. So the hardtop in this is kind of a pain in the rear. It has two latches in the front, behind the visors, and then it has two latches in the back, behind the seats. Because it's difficult, sometimes removing the hardtop involves a little bit of swearing, and this is a family show. So instead, we're gonna use a little movie magic. Ready? And it's gone.
Much easier than doing it the hard way.
That was perfect.
It's so self-aware too, because I clearly we descended to. Oh, that's
Maybe words were only lies. What's left to say?
So here we are in the interior. There are some kind of luxurious features for this more upscale car, and then there are some less luxurious features. I like the interior. It's vinyl. You know, it's nothing super fancy, but it does have nice stitching. It's got the decorative stitching on the doors. And then you have, of course, your usual handles, including one that you can grab that isn't the winder and isn't the latch to pull the door shut. I appreciate that. I love this chrome strip down here, the kind of kick guard thing. It's functional and also decorative. The steering wheel is wood. This is the appropriate steering wheel for this car. The horn is in the steering wheel, at least, not in the stock. You know, this fabulous little ring, which is in a great position if you're gripping the wheel in panic. You also have wood veneer on the dashboard. So you have your fuel gauge, you have your panel lights that turn on the lights so you can see what your gauges are actually saying. So these little guys, these are lights. They're your alert lights. They tell you things like your high beams are on, your turn signals are on, that kind of thing. And we have 3 of them. I love how they look like little jewels set into the dashboard. But the really cool thing about them is you can toggle them. So you can like push them up and down. That will dim or brighten the light in case, you know, your Lucas Electrics are blinding you while you're driving down the road. You can turn that down so it doesn't distress you. So we also have these weird little metal plates. We have 3 of them, 1, 2, 3. Those cover up holes that would have either had switches that only came in the Alpine or other optional things, like a cigarette lighter, which we don't have. We have an ashtray, but we don't have a cigarette lighter. This is where the optional clock would have gone. This is the only place in this car where it says Roots Group. There's no glove box, but there is a nice little cubby where you can put things like knitting. Don't put papers in there, especially with the top off. They will fly away. You have a light here so you can see into that cubby, hypothetically. To add to the uselessness of this cubby, it looks great, but there's this hole right here, which I suppose makes it a good grab handle, but it means that if you put anything over on this side of the compartment, it'll just fall out like that. So, not very useful. So I think the shifter is pretty cool, and part of the reason for that is the way that you shift into reverse. There are all kinds of ways that manufacturers of cars have invented in order to keep you from shifting into reverse accidentally. And on this one, it's this lever here. You pull up on it in order to shift into reverse. If you don't pull up on it, it won't do it. We have the air blower, that's your fan. You have your windshield wiper switch there. And then this is your pump to clean your windshield. So you have to manually sit there and do this in order to clean your windshield. It's not a push it in and it's done. Down here you have your usual gas, brake, clutch, and then you have this knob here that you push with your foot, and that turns your high beams on and off. So that's a rather cunning little thing. These are your heater controls. This is like hot or cold, and this one controls where the air goes. You know, does it go into the car? Does it go up against the windshield to defrost it? Things like that. This section originally had labels on it. They're gone now. We think that they got lost during an earlier restoration, but we know what they do. We have our clearly labeled bonnet switch. That's what I pulled earlier. This is a knob. It's called V for vent. It opens up fresh air vents that come into the footwells. So instead of a glove box, you have an armrest that locks. You just push the button and pull up. And that's where we can keep our registration and all those things.
I hope you're happy with what you've done. Well, I ain't mad, just getting gone. We had a fun, but now it's over and done.
So, sun visors in this are stiff and difficult. They do not pop out and go to the side, they strictly go up and down. However, there is a cool detail about the passenger side sun visor. That is that it has been signed by Shelby. Alex says that's not that special because apparently he signed everything, but it's still signed by him.
Go away, Carol Shelby.
So here we are on this beautiful autumn morning. It is officially fall now. I'd like to start by saying I love this car. It's really fun.
You say that about every car.
I do, but I do. But I love them all. This is like one of the first times I've driven this car. I did practice in it a little bit earlier, but it was really easy to pick up. It wants you to drive it. Not only that, but it wants you to drive it quickly. It's torquey, it's hard to stall, track's straight, brakes are good, though they do have kind of an interesting feature where the booster doesn't kick in until a certain point in your travel on the pedal, so you have to be aware of that because when it grabs, it grabs.
Yeah, I think that's because the booster got rebuilt. This car's been pretty heavily restored, and when the booster got rebuilt, it's sticking a little bit on the valve in it. And so it doesn't necessarily realize you're demanding brake assistance from the booster until after you've actually got a fair amount of power. Then it says, oh, you want it? Here you go. Here's all of it.
And then I'm just gentle with it when it's like, okay, we need to stop soon, so I'll start putting on the brakes a little bit earlier. Mostly because I don't want to throw us through the windshield, by having to slam on the brakes. We have seatbelts, so we're safe, but,
Yeah, our other Sunbeam Tiger doesn't do that. It brakes much more evenly, and so I really think it's a case of just the booster needing to brake in.
Yeah. This car is super happy going most of the time in third. It's an engine that's happy revving higher, but I really enjoy the driving experience with this car. It wants enough from you to keep you involved, but it's not incredibly demanding.
Yeah.
And the clutch isn't super stiff. I mean, nothing is really hard for me to engage all the way and all those things.
And in general, it's a pretty solid car. It doesn't have any rattles. These are actually really pretty well built. It's not a light body. It's definitely a fairly heavily made steel body, but at the same time, it's well assembled.
Yes. And while I may complain about the steering on this when I'm trying to get out of a parking spot or something, when you're moving,
it's pretty light.
It's pretty light. It's not bad at all. This is also a remarkably comfortable car. The seats are nice. It's still pretty basic in here, but you have everything you need. I will say another thing I really like about this car is how much room I have in the footwell. I don't have to rest my foot on the clutch.
Yeah, plenty of space. So Oregon, spring and fall tend to be great times for convertibles here.
Yes.
And we've got the heater on in this car, and the heater actually does work. It does put out a reasonable amount of heat. But with the top off and the windows down and all that, you're losing a lot of it.
Yeah,
it's all going in the footwell right now.
Yes. It's breezy in here.
Yeah.
Definitely.
My legs are pretty comfortable.
Should have brought scarves or something this morning.
Yeah. And if we got too cold, we could always put the top up, trap some of the heat in. But we don't really need it.
I prefer driving with the top down. But also, I really love the visibility of having the top down, especially on a car like this that it has no side mirrors. It has that. So I am really happy with where my driving confidence is at this point. I feel more like I can climb into almost anything and drive it, assuming that I can reach the clutch pedal and everything.
Yeah, the more cars you drive, the easier it gets to do exactly that.
I now am like, ooh, when I see the little wiggly curves coming up sign, I'm actually a little bit excited about it as opposed to, oh no, scary.
Your engine of love. All you do is turn me on. I'll keep going on and on.
You know, there's cars that judge you and test you. And it's like, are you worthy? This is not one of those cars. This car is like, yeah, let's go drive. Let's go do stuff. I want to be out on the road. We talked about how we're going to do this channel until it's not fun anymore, and well, I don't see not fun anymore happening anytime soon, so that makes me happy.
I really like driving Tigers. They're really very pleasant cars to drive. They're happy cruising along at low speeds, they're happy at high speeds, generally just a very comfortable, very classic British roadster. But with a much stronger American edge with that V8. The sound of it is amazing.
Yes.
I've driven MGBs, I've driven a lot of MGs, I've driven a lot of Triumphs. This feels in a lot of ways the same sort of vein as those cars. It definitely feels like you're driving a British car, but one with significantly more power, more performance. It's still a little tiny British roadster. It still has all the great things that I love about those kinds of cars, but it has that American V8 rumble and the V8 torque and the V8 power. It's not a little four-cylinder. It's not an inline six. I mean, there are some great inline sixes that are reasonably powerful things, but they don't sound like this. They don't feel like this.
Woke up early, just another day. Kept my money in my sock when I got paid. Stay fresh, new J's and a clean fade. Always on the streets like a runaway.
It handles relatively well. There are some compromises in the steering geometry that came out of trying to fit the V8 in here too. That kind of causes some weirdness with steering at high speed, some bump steer. But in general, for touring, it's fine. Racing, there are things you need to probably sort out if you really want to race one of these. But I've seen them race pretty successfully. So even from that end, they're pretty good cars. So for anyone looking for a Tiger, go for it. You'll enjoy the car. One way or another, you'll enjoy the car. The biggest issue is that there's a lot of fake Tigers out there too, because they really just took an Alpine and cut it up and put a big engine in it. And it's not that hard for someone else to take an Alpine, cut it up, and put a big engine in it, and then put Tiger badges on it and claim that it's actually a Tiger, when it isn't. I'm not saying that it's bad to necessarily buy an Alpine with a V8 engine crammed into it. Go for it. But know that you're buying an Alpine with a V8 engine. Don't pay Tiger money for an Alpine.
Yes.
There's enough of a issue with it that there's a certification program out there to certify whether it's a genuine Tiger or not. This car's been certified. It's a genuine Tiger. It has all of the odd little things that are different between a Tiger and an Alpine. It has all the modifications done the way they were originally done. And in all, they didn't build that many of these. I mean, they built a fair number. We definitely have rarer cars, but for the type of car that it is, there really aren't that many out there. And for a long time, they weren't worth much. It was just sort of a poor man's Shelby. And part of that, I think, had to do with the fact that it didn't have the engine originally built up as much as it could be. That the vast majority of them are 260s, as opposed to 289s. But even the 260 is a very fun car to drive. It is a very nice touring car. And for roads like this, it's absolutely fantastic.
It's enjoyable to ride in as well as to drive. Though I will say it's probably more fun to drive. And normally I'm very content to be in the passenger seat a lot of the time, but this one it was kind of like, oh, can I go just a little bit further? Just a little bit more? But, this is not my only opportunity to drive this car, so it's,
It's a great opportunity, but it's not your only one.
Exactly.
We're going to now stop, pull off all the cameras, and turn around.
Okay, see you on the next thing. Bye. Okay, we're back in the studio after another fantastic drive, and now it's time for the Haugland Score.
Here's how it works.
Alex and I have individually rated the car in 5 categories, each with a rank of 0 to 10. Then we add our scores together to give us the final Haugland score.
After we combine our scores, the results go up on the board. So our first category is performance. For this car, it has amazing performance, especially compared to a 4-cylinder version of essentially the same thing. Having that V8 engine really gives it great performance, so I gave it an 8.
And I gave it a 7. The V8 makes a big difference. I liked how it accelerated. I liked that it tracked straight. The brakes are good.
The handling's not too bad. It's not as good as it could be, but it is still pretty good as a touring car.
It's decent.
It's decent.
So for style, I gave it a 6. Not because it's not a really nice looking car, but because it copies a lot of elements from American cars from an earlier period. It's not doing anything new.
And I gave it a 6 actually for kind of the same reasons. It's a British roadster, and it looks like a Triumph in many ways. It looks like an MG in many ways. It doesn't break any molds at all. There are some nice features to it, really nice hardtop, but at the same point, there's nothing really groundbreaking about it.
Absolutely.
So for drivability, I actually gave it a 7. A lot of that has to do with that hardtop. With the hardtop on the car, it's actually pretty watertight. It's very usable. The trunk is not the best, but it is not bad. It really kind of meets all of the basic demands of what I'd look for in a drivable car. You could drive it every day if you really wanted to, especially for a convertible, a British convertible of this era. The other great thing is the majority of the mechanicals are Ford. They're readily available at Napa or any parts stores. So that makes it actually a very usable car, even for long distance touring in areas that don't have really good foreign car support.
And I gave it an 8. I could drive that every day. I wouldn't worry about parking it anywhere. It's small and narrow enough to fit into any parking space and give everybody around you plenty of room. You can drive it in all weathers. It's a fun little car. I'm not taking it to Costco, but you don't need to. So for significance, I gave it a 6. A lot of people at the time viewed it as sort of an upgraded Alpine. Again, it wasn't doing anything new. The V8 kicks the score up a little bit because that was kind of new and gave the car more power and usability. But again, it wasn't groundbreaking.
So when I gave it a 5, it really wasn't a great seller in many ways. They built a fair number of them, but not anything outstanding. They built far more Alpines and sold far more Alpines. Okay, you've got a Carroll Shelby association, but Shelby was basically hired to do a job. It's not something that he really went out of his way to design. It's not something that had quite as much of his involvement as the AC Cobra or any of the Shelby Mustangs. It's one of those cars that it's like, okay, it fills a void, but it's not one that's also typically very memorable to a lot of people. There's a few people who know what it is by sight, but not that many. For delight, I gave it a 6. It is an enjoyable car to drive, but it's a touring car. It's not something that I feel like incredibly special. It's a great car. It's a nice car to drive. It's a great car to tour in. But at the same time, I don't know, it just doesn't quite grab me the same way as some of our other cars.
So for delight, I gave it a 6. I love driving it. It is a fun little car to hop into and just drive around. And there are people who recognize it and like it. It doesn't get the same reaction that a lot of our other cars get, because it is a good specimen of a classic British roadster.
Yeah.
That's what it is, and it fills that space incredibly well, but that doesn't mean that everybody around us loves it in the same way.
Absolutely. So, after all of that math, that gives us a final score of 65 for a 1967 Sunbeam Tiger. That puts it just 1 point shy of Ross and Healey 100S at 15th place.
I feel like that's really fair, and that, I feel, describes this car really well. It is a fair car.
Yes, it is. Sunbeam built a good car. It is a good car.
Yes.
But at the same point, it's not the most amazing car ever made. Okay. If you feel that we've completely erred on this, if that this is the worst possible ranking we could have done, that we've got the wrong end of the stick, hey, let us know. I'm not sure I'll agree with you, but I'd be happy to read your comments and comment back.
I also want to know why. Whether you agree with us or disagree with us. Did you ever own a Tiger? Did you know someone who did? We love hearing your stories, and we love interacting with y'all.
We've got several cool cars coming up, including one that should actually be a really interesting comparison to the Tiger, coming up in a future episode very shortly. So I won't tell you what it is. You'll have to watch, subscribe, click the notification bell, and you'll find out then.
Don't forget to tell your friends.
Okay.
See you next
See
time.
ya. Bye.
The Tiger really does have a nice growl.
Yes.
Roar.
Rawr.